Eu comecei a aprender português 5 anos atrás. Hoje em dia, eu moro no Brasil e eu uso meu português todos os dias. E eu não sei como rotular meu português, eu não sei se eu sou fluente, se eu tenho um português... sei lá, eu diria que eu tenho um português avançado. Mas eu nunca fiz um teste oficial para realmente saber. Mas enfim, eu só queria fazer esse vídeo para compartilhar como que foi minha jornada de aprendizado do português, como que eu cheguei a esse ponto, e quais recursos eu usei e como que eu usei para desenvolver minha fala e meu entendimento do idioma. So 5 years ago I lived in Boston, and if you don't know, in Boston there are a lot of Portuguese immigrants. And so I would hear a lot of Portuguese on the streets, there were a lot of signs in Portuguese, and just via exposure, I one day became curious about Portuguese. And so the day I became curious, I went into Spotify and I started looking for Brazilian songs. I found a couple that I liked, and I'm the type of person that when I find a song that I like, I'm gonna listen to it on repeat like 1,000 times. And so that's what I did with these songs. There came a point where I had listened to these songs so much that I basically memorized them. I then wanted to start learning how to read and to spell. And so to do that, I would just pull up the lyrics and follow along. And so my goal with reading the lyrics while listening to the songs was to get to a point where nothing that I heard surprised me when I saw it written. Once I got to that point, the next step up was I picked new songs and I would start writing what I thought I was hearing. I would literally spend my evenings doing this for several months. I would lock myself in my room and just listen and write. And this was a painful process, but I really wanted to develop a good ear for the language. This helped my Portuguese so much, and I'm so thankful that I did this when I look back. This probably took 6 to 8 months. Now, at this point, I wanted to have some more structure because while it was great that I could listen and spell and read, I still didn't really know how to speak. And this is where I found Speaking Brazilian. Speaking Brazilian, in my opinion, is the most comprehensive resource for anyone who wants to learn Portuguese. They have videos that they put out weekly. They have a podcast version of this, so basically just the audio of those videos on Spotify. And of course, they have classes. So when I first discovered Brazilian Portuguese, I was just using the free content. So I would watch videos, and since the videos have captions in both English and Portuguese, this is how I started to develop my vocabulary. So I was doing this every day for 1 or 2 months. Finally, I decided at some point that I wanted to start taking classes, and I took somewhere between 10 to 20 classes over the course of a couple months. And all the while, I was still doing everything else I was doing beforehand with the music. So Speaking Brazilian is really what took me from a beginner level to an intermediate level. And then I got to a point where I felt like the only thing I needed to do at this point was to start learning more advanced vocabulary using authentic Brazilian content online. What I'm really talking about is TV shows and YouTube videos. Now, I want to spend some time talking about TV shows because I actually started using TV shows way back in the beginning. There are 2 TV shows in particular that I watched several times, like 5 or 6 times. 3% and Coisa Mais Linda. The reason I watched these so many times is because I ended up using these 2 shows as measuring sticks for my progress. The first 1 or 2 times, I would watch the shows in Portuguese with Portuguese subtitles. Now, I knew that I wasn't gonna understand the complete storyline. I was just trying to match what I was hearing with the written words, much like I was already doing with music. Now, I was having contact with Portuguese every day, whether it was music or whether it was the classes I was taking with Speaking Brazilian or the videos or the podcasts. And so just by way of having contact every day, I was improving my Portuguese, right? And so about every 6 months or so, I would watch the shows again. Now, around the 3rd time I watched the shows, I put the subtitles in English, just so I could finally really understand in detail what was going on in the show. And then, 6 months later, when I watched for the 4th or whatever time, I put the subtitles back in Portuguese. And then, the last 1 or 2 times, I would watch without subtitles. All of this happened over the course of 2 years. And you might be thinking, well, that's a really long process. And it is, I told you that I've been learning Portuguese for 5 years. I'll be open about the fact that this is probably not the fastest way to learn a language. But at the same time, I feel like I developed such a deep relationship with the language, right? From spending just straight 6 months just listening and not even trying to learn what anything means. And then using TV shows for 2 years to measure my progress and watching them 5 or 6 times and then having contact with the language every day. I mean, this is what it means to like get stuck in a language and to really dedicate yourself to it. Now I want to shift back and talk a little bit about timelines. At the beginning of 2022, by this point I had been learning Portuguese for 2 years now. I came to Brazil for the first time. I was working remotely. And I remember that when I would go to speak with people, Spanish would come out of my mouth. And I would have to stop and think a lot for Portuguese to be able to come out. But this went away after a couple weeks of being forced to speak. I stayed here for 4 months, and then I went back to the US for a year and a half. I wasn't speaking Portuguese as much, so I lost a little bit my ability to speak. But again, I was still maintaining contact with the language throughout all this time, primarily through music and TV shows. Then at the beginning of last year, 2024, I moved back to Brazil, and I've been here ever since. And now I'm at a point where I don't listen to music to learn anymore because there are, so few words that I don't know now. Of course, there are words I don't know and there are expressions I don't know, but that is not the majority of the time. And now I really make like a concerted effort to improve my Portuguese or learn something new when it just kind of pops up in front of me when I'm on my computer. So one of the resources that I use till today is Plain Portuguese. I think it is a fantastic channel. Bia does an excellent job of explaining things in a simple and concise way, and she always asks for comments and interactions with her videos. I try to take advantage of those as well. Other than that, I just kind of walk around. I always have like a little notebook that I carry around to write down a word or an expression that's new. And I spend most of my time learning, just speaking with people. And at this point, I'm not so focused on vocabulary. Where I feel like I can improve is my intonation and my rhythm. And so this is just kind of where I'm at. At this point, I'm content. Eu consigo falar sobre basicamente qualquer assunto sem ter que pensar muito. Claro que eu erro ainda às vezes e eu tenho um sotaque, mas eu acho que tenho um entendimento muito profundo do idioma, tanto que quando eu aprendo uma nova palavra, uma nova expressão, eu sei como manipulá-las para poder usá-las na minha fala. Enfim, that was like a general overview of my language learning journey. I'm gonna link things that I referenced to down in the description. So thanks for watching e até mais.